Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I heard there's been so many amazing tracks and sessions, and so I'm so thankful that you decided to join us today. My name is Tamara Brummer, and I'm with Demand Justice, and we're going to present a presentation called Democracy on Fire. And I'm really thankful and glad to be joined by my colleague, Lanita King, who is leading some amazing work at Demand Justice as well. So we'll just jump right on in. So I'm Tamara Brummer. I am our senior advisor at Demand Justice. I've been at Demand Justice since June of 2020, but in the pandemic, what's that mean? But before that, I was a union organizer, and I worked almost exclusively in the labor movement, and really starting to understand more and more that the organizing that we do on the ground is impacted by so many forces, including our federal judiciary. And so that's why I'm really excited that we're able to join you all today to talk about, the things that we have at stake and all the great organizing that we're doing. But if we do not protect and defend our federal courts, it can often feel like it's an odds. So I'm going to turn it over to Lanita, and she'll take it from here.
Thank you, Tamara. Hi, everybody. I'm Lanita King. As Tamara mentioned, I'm the State Engagement Director here at Demand Justice. Some of you may have seen or heard a version of this before. Our messaging has pretty much been the same and stronger as we've lived through the last presidential administration. But I just want to kind of jump in from the start, give everybody a little bit of context of how we got here, and then we'll turn it back over to Tamara towards the end to tell us what we can do to protect our democracy and our values. So with that, we can go ahead and pull up the presentation. Great. So there's so much going on. There's so many headlines and stories, and literally all the things are on fire. Democracy is on fire. Sometimes it's hard to focus on that, and we lose the forest and all of the trees. So no matter if it's the fight for healthcare, like Tamara mentioned, the right to protect an environment, reuniting families, ensuring the right to vote, the courts, both state and federal, ultimately decide what can be done and what is legal and allowable. So it all comes down to the courts, which is why we're here today. Next slide. You can go ahead. One more, Chris. Thanks. So we're going to go ahead and start with the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. So what's going on at the court? Sometimes in history, the Supreme Court has been an important force for good in decisions like Roe v. Wade and Brown versus Board of Education. Next slide. But right now, we can see that the court is dominated by a right-wing and partisan majority, which brings us to the point that our rights and our democracy are at risk every single day. Next slide. So we have 9 justices on the court. There's nothing special about that number. In fact, it's been changed a few times over the years. These justices are nominated by the president, and they're approved by the Senate for lifetime appointments. There are 3 judges considered to be the liberal wing of the court. Justice Sotomayor, the first Latina on the court, one, if not the most progressive voice on the court. We also have Justice Breyer, who is a little bit more moderate, and Justice Elena Kagan, who is also pretty moderate. So the rest of the partisan majority consists of Clarence Thomas, who is accused of sexual assault at his confirmation hearing and whose wife had very close ties in the Trump administration. There's Samuel Alito, who is a strong clinical conservative. Neil Gorsuch, who, fun fact, sits in Merrick Garland's stolen seat. Brett Kavanaugh, the awful man who has 83 ethics complaints against him at the time of his confirmation. And then Amy Coney Barrett, who was pushed through to replace RBG right before the election last year, thus stealing another seat from the people, which I am personally still bitter about. Next slide. So I want to take a step back and talk just a little bit more about Chief Justice John Roberts. He is a conservative who was appointed by George W. Bush. He oversaw the Trump impeachment trial, I guess we should say, which was notable due to its lack of witness testimony. In the wild world that we live in today, he is considered to be the swing vote on the Republican-dominated bench, even though he's the one who's overseen some of the most awful and partisan decisions, particularly around voting rights. And if you take a look at his record, he has a lot of breadcrumbs in his past that we can see where he has been attacking voting rights ever since he started with his law degree. So now I want to take a second to talk about the 3 Trump justices who are a direct threat to our democracy. Next slide. Oh, no, you're right. So the first is Amy Coney Barrett, who is, as I mentioned, she was the one who was pushed through last year after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. She is one of the 3 appointed Supreme Court justices that Trump appointed during his tenure as president. He has appointed the most Supreme Court justices than any other president. The other one is Neil Gorsuch, who also sits in a stolen seat, stolen by Trump. He sits in Merrick Garland's stolen seat to the maneuvering by Mitch McConnell, who effectively changed the size of the court by leaving that seat open for over a year. And then there's Brett Kavanaugh, who I mentioned before, who has had a slew of credible sexual assault allegations against him, as well as some very suspicious financial circumstances. We should mention that, taking a step back, that Amy Coney Barrett was actually a protege of Antonin Scalia. She was very outspoken on her beliefs that the ACA and Roe v. Wade were decided wrongly, and she's almost guaranteed to vote to overturn both of them. So that's just a very clear example of how this group of people are clear threats to our democracy. So, them getting here was as a result of a 30-plus year plan to steal the courts. So next slide. And we're going to dive a little bit more into what that plan was. We ended up with this partisan majority due to the fact that Republicans were very strategic, and they enacted a long-term and intentional plan to take the courts. This is not by accident. They weren't lucky and happened upon a gold mine in the judiciary. They actively schemed and planned and plotted for years to ensure that whatever they wanted for the rich and wealthy would be law. So this all started in the 70s and 80s with big business and corporate interests being greedy and wanting to write their own rules to rig the game. So in order to get away with it, they needed judges on their side. So they started spending some serious money to ensure that these referees or judges were in their pocket. And there's a ton of organizations that were created as vehicles for this specific line of work, but I want to talk about the big 3. The big 3 are the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank that, among other things, thinks that climate change is fake. There's the Judicial Crisis Network, which is a conservative group who pledged to spend $10 million to ensure Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. And there's the Federalist Society, who was once thought to have fringe ideas, but since then they have become very, very powerful and a staple in this arrangement of people. As we think about and conceptualize what these 3 groups of people are, the biggest element that's missing in most of their conversations is the voice of the American people. There's the lack of consideration. We get no say in it. It's just a group of very wealthy people with a lot of money and resources to spend to make things only good for themselves and their other wealthy friends and family, the corporations, not the American people. So I do want to take a step back and talk a little bit more specifically about FedSoc. So you can go to the next slide, please. FedSoc calls themselves a debate club. They call themselves a group of people interested in the current state of the legal order. They say that their goals are like reordering the legal system and putting a premium on traditional values. In reality, they have strong ties to conservative dark money, and they use that money to normalize their crazy fringe ideas. And probably one of the most damning things about them is that they give input to every GOP president since Reagan on judges and have been given near total control under Trump. And just because he's gone from office doesn't mean that they still don't have that power. So the way that they maneuver is they start recruiting folks in law schools They literally start grooming students for judgeships while they haven't even passed their bar. They haven't done it. They start them very, very early in the process. In fact, all 6 of the Republican judges currently on the Supreme Court have had ties to FedSoc from years and decades ago up until today. And just for the sake of wrapping a bow on how this type of dark money flows, some of the people funding FedSoc are the same people donating to Mitch McConnell. They're the same people donating to the Heritage Foundation and Judicial Crisis Network and dozens of other extremely right-wing groups and Republican elected officials. So next, we should talk a little bit more about how these people have used their power to start dismantling our democracy and what that actually means. We're just going to talk a little bit more about what they paid for. And there is actually a lot to cover, but we're just going to highlight some of the very clear trends that we've seen over the last 10 years, more importantly, during Trump's last administration. So some of the key trends that we see 6 unelected justices serving lifetime appointments, voting together to limit the right freedoms of 100 million Americans. You can go to the next slide. So we saw this with cases involving gerrymandering, voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, and restricting early vote access. Pre-Amy Coney Barrett, the 5 men on the court were literally banding together to figure out how to make voting the most difficult and inaccessible for folks. And we saw it time after time, specifically in like Wisconsin and Florida. There are no shortage of examples of them actively attacking our democracy. Next slide. So, still pre-Amy Coney Barrett, these 5 Republican men constantly delivered for Trump. So instead of doing their job and checking his abuse of powers, they made decisions and laid things out in a way to protect him and his agenda, be it the border wall or the ban on transgendered service members, the Muslim ban, his tax returns. These are all clear examples of them delivering and staying on his side. And if we had more time, we could talk about the firing of directors at entities and ignoring subpoenas from Congress. But the thing that's the most clear is that the Republican bloc are too far partisan and too far political. And they have only gained more power now that Amy Coney Barrett has been confirmed. So they've opened, all right, next slide if you haven't already gone. They've opened the floodgates for billionaires and corporations to try to buy elections, even more so now than there were before. They overturned a key part of the Voting Rights Act, which was a passion project for John Roberts. Like I mentioned in the beginning, he has been working on restricting voting rights from his time in the Revolution. More recently, they forced people to choose between their right to vote and their safety in Wisconsin in the middle of the whole panoramic, and upheld a poll tax for returning citizens in Florida. So the next trend we're going to talk about is the corporate special interest piece, which is still especially important today, even under a Biden administration. The Republican appointed justices are tilting the law in favor of the rich and powerful and against everyone else, right? They're making it extremely hard for people in the public sector to work in a union, and there could be more to come. I worry that a lot of us were like, cool, we can get all the things we want to get done now, where progressives are in the majority, but the buck kind of stops at the courts. And this is one clear way or a clear example of where everything that we've been working and fighting for is in grave danger. They've made it so much easier for companies to kick consumers out of court with forced arbitration. The court has sided with banks. They've changed the structure of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. All the things that we have worked and fought for as protections for ourselves are being dismantled at the courts. And the people behind the courts are the people with corporate special interests. And that's how all these things kind of tie together. One key takeaway, we can go to the next slide, is that frustratingly enough, Supreme Court justices are exempt from a code of ethics. They're almost untouchable during their lifetime appointment. as a reminder, as I've been saying, these people aren't chosen by American people. They aren't elected. They have next to no accountability. And that's one of the cornerstones of why our democracy is, in fact, on fire, and this court is a political threat to everything that we've been working for. So I'm going to turn it over to Terma to give us some insight as to what's really at stake, and then more importantly, what could we possibly do to protect ourselves and our democracy.
Thank you so much, Lanita, for laying that out for us. I just want to really nail home. There's a few things. First off, it's not a coincidence that our courts are under attack and that they're not the most democratic body. It's not a coincidence that the Republicans have been able to legislate through the federal judiciary and not through the houses of Congress and the Senate, the people's elected bodies, to make decisions for our greater good. But Republicans have used one of the most least democratic branches of the federal government to legislate their desires and their whims. So what's at stake with a partisan court? So the next slide, please. One more. Are y'all having fun in digital world? I wish I could see you all. One more slide, please. We got a lot of slides. Thank you. So, as Lanita has laid out, it all comes down to the courts. Everything that we are fighting for and advocating for with Congress and President Biden has the possibility of being undone by the state level and ultimately at the federal level in the Supreme Court of the United States. That includes voting rights, where Lanita has laid out so clearly, the Roberts Courts has already gutted the Voting Rights Act and could do the same with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and H.R. 1. That means that Roe v. Wade is in even more danger. We have a significantly lower chance of enacting responsible gun control, the Green New Deal, Medicare for all. Everything is in danger of being dismantled or thrown out. And right now, we need to do everything in our power to protect our democracy. We should also mention that in order to achieve any of these goals, we need to get rid of the filibuster. Full stop. It's racist, dated, and Republicans are using it to prevent progressive policies from getting passed. We can only expand the court if we get rid of the racist filibuster. Next slide, please. So in our theory of change, there's many things that we need to do. Lanita mentioned we need to have a code of conduct for our judicial candidates, our judges on the federal bench. But the most immediate thing that we can do right now to bring back the balance to our federal judiciary, to pave the way for all the things that we're fighting to protect and defend our democracy, is that we need to add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. That's the only way to restore balance immediately. Not yesterday, not 20 years from now, but today. We need to add 4 seats. Expansion is not the only reform our courts need, but that includes term limits and code of ethics, but it's the most immediate thing that we can do. And if you're an organizer, you understand that we have to take the first steps to build towards something better. And the first steps for us in protecting and defending our democracy through our federal courts is to expand the court. Next slide, please. So what does it mean to expand the court? That means we need a court that better reflects the whole country, not just special interests and the Republican Party. I don't know if you know this, but in the whole history of the Supreme Court, there's never been a Black woman even nominated to the court, let alone confirmed. What's that mean for Black women who have been building and protecting our democracy? We saw the work that Black women have been doing the past 5 years to protect and defend our democracy, but we don't have representation at the highest court in the land. So one of the first steps in adding seats to the court is straightforward, it's constitutional, and grounded in history. The size of the court has changed several times already. If you remember, when the news broke that Justice Scalia had died and his seat would be open, Mitch McConnell immediately stated he wouldn't allow the Senate to consider any nominations by President Obama, because there's no constitutional rules around those things, so he can do whatever he wants. That death left a 422-day vacancy, the longest since 1869. McConnell essentially changed the size of the court for 1 year. And in another example, the last time that we officially changed the size of the court was during the Civil War. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to prevent white supremacists from trying to shape and dictate what the nation needed to do in that crisis. I don't think that things are not that much different now, that we are still fighting against white supremacy and racist policies, and that by changing our courts and expanding our courts, we have a better chance of defending and protecting our democracy. The next slide, please. So what does this mean? We're talking about it, and it can often feel that the courts are a very theoretical thing. To Lanita's point, we don't get to vote per se on our Supreme Court justices or our lower court justices, but we can demand that changes be made and that the will of the people will prevail. So last month, President Biden announced a court reform commission to study reform to the Supreme Court. Although that's a novel idea, the reality is that we can't wait for a commission of academics to tell us what we need to make our diversity more robust, to protect our wins, and to protect our future. We need action now. So Representatives Hank Johnson, Jerry Nadler, Mondaire Jones, and Senator Ed Markey have introduced the Judiciary Act of 2021, which is a bill to simply add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. Our task now is to build a grassroots movement that puts pressure on every single Democrat in Congress to support this legislation, because it's the only way we can restore the balance to our courts and to protect our democracy. And thankfully, I will say, I'm glad to be working at an organization that's leading the charge to organize support for this bill. Next slide, please. So none of this happens because we just sit around and we talk to each other. It happens because we organize, right? So the support for adding seats to the court has never been higher. Polling has shown us that American people and a diverse swath of American people want to see our courts expand because they understand what's happening. We need to convince some of our leadership, though. We need to convince Nancy Pelosi to bring the bill up for a vote on the floor and Chuck Schumer to do the same in the Senate. The only way we can achieve this is by showing that expanding the court has the support of all Democrats. That's why the first step is pressuring our Democratic House members and senators to announce that they will co-sponsor the Judiciary Act. We've already gotten verbal support from some key players like AOC and Ilhan Omar, but what we need them to really do is just to go ahead and co-sponsor the actual legislation to expand the courts. So how do we do this? Next slide, please. Well, if they're in this session right now, they'll know that they need to take action. But in case that they're not, that they didn't join us today, there's a few things that we, the people, can do. And I really am calling on you to help us and to stand with us to make sure that we can protect and defend our democracy through our federal courts. So we're thinking about this and building a grassroots movement. So the first thing we need to do, we're asking folks to join a virtual meeting between volunteers and your member of Congress in office. It's so important for Congress people around the country to hear from their constituents about why this is so important to them and why they need to stand side by side and support the Judiciary Act of 2021. The second thing we're asking volunteers to do is to sign up to write letters to voters and campaign donors. The only way that we can build our movement is if we talk to people. And campaign donors are a really good way to engage an audience as well as push electeds to do the right thing. And then the last thing that we're asking folks to do is call your member of Congress. And we have a really cool patch through tool. We have a team of organizers who are actually working right now patching through calls. It just takes 10 minutes right now to call your member of Congress and urge them to support the bill. Next slide, please. So I know that we're going to drop these links in the chat, so that people will have them and they'll be easy for you to copy and paste and take action immediately. But you can also visit demandjustice.com/court-reform to find more information. That's demandjustice.com/court-reform. I really want to make it clear that everything that we are fighting for is in danger of being dismantled if we continue to let the Roberts Court stand in our way. Just think about it. We passed comprehensive health care years ago, almost a decade ago. And what have Republicans decided to do? Instead of letting that be the law of the land, instead of listening to the people who have decided this, the American people, they've decided to legislate healthcare and our federal judiciary. And now we're even waiting to hear from this current Supreme Court session if we will be able to protect healthcare. And as Lanita lifted up already, we are constantly under attack around voting rights. That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that in 2013, the John Roberts courts dismantled the most substantial parts of the Voting Rights Act, and now we're fighting to even give people water and food while they vote. So I really hope that you all will join us in this fight to protect and defend our democracy and to protect and defend our federal courts. And that is a place where we, the people, actually are seen and heard. So I don't know. I think we might have a chance for a couple of questions, but if not, thank you all so much for everything you all are doing and for joining us today.